The morning of March 4th, 1944. 27,000 feet above the English Channel, First Lieutenant Robert Johnson tightened his leather glove around the throttle of his P-51B Mustang. The compass needle pointed due east. Berlin lay 560 miles ahead. Behind him stretched another 49 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group, their polished aluminum skins catching the pale winter sun. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Below, 350 B-17 Flying Fortresses droned eastward in their combat boxes, each carrying 2 tons of high explosives toward the German capital. Johnson had been flying combat missions for nearly a year. He knew the rhythm of bomber escort the way other men knew their morning routines. The P-47 Thunderbolts would shepherd the heavies as far as the Dutch border, then waggle their wings and peel away when their fuel tanks ran dry. That had always been the moment when the killing began. Without their little friends, the bombers would lumber onward alone, while Luftwaffe fighters assembled over the horizon, waiting to tear them apart over Germany's industrial heartland. Johnson had watched it happen dozens of times. He had seen B-17 seconds shed wings in spiraling death dives. He had counted parachutes blooming white against winter clouds, knowing each one represented a man who might not live to see England again. But today was different. Today, for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort the heavies all the way to Berlin and back, over 1,100 miles of hostile airspace. The Germans had designed their entire air defense strategy around a simple calculation. No fighter on Earth possessed sufficient range to protect bombers during deep penetration raids. The Luftwaffe had only to wait until the escorts turned back, then strike with impunity against defenseless bomber formations. It was mathematics, not courage, that determined survival. The Germans had run those numbers 1,000 times. They knew. They were right. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they had been. The story of how American fighters appeared over Berlin begins not with aerial combat, but with organizational desperation and industrial accident. In April 1940, as the German Wehrmacht prepared to launch its Western offensive, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an emergency request. Britain's aircraft factories, already straining to replace losses from the air battles over France, needed help. The Commission wanted North American to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The P-40 was adequate but unremarkable, powered by an Allison engine that performed respectably at low altitude but wheezed above 15,000 feet. James Kindleberger, North American's president, made a counter-proposal that seemed absurd given the timeline. Instead of building someone else's mediocre fighter, he would design and build an entirely new aircraft in 120 days. The British, desperate enough to gamble, agreed. Kindleberger's team produced the NA-73X, which first flew on October 26, 1940. The British named it Mustang. The early Mustang was extraordinary in some ways and fatally limited in others. Its laminar flow wing, designed using wind tunnel data from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, produced remarkably low drag. The aircraft could reach 390 miles per hour at altitude and had an operational range of 750 miles, figures that seemed almost fictional compared to contemporary fighters. But the Allison V1000 710 engine that powered it suffered the same high-altitude weakness as the P-40. Above 20,000 feet, where bomber formations cruised to avoid flak, the Mustang became sluggish and vulnerable. British pilots used the early Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where it performed superbly. But as a high-altitude fighter, it was useless. The transformation came through a chance observation by a test pilot. In early 1942, someone suggested mating the Mustang's efficient airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered Britain's Spitfires. The Merlin featured a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitude. When North American received Packard-built Merlin engines and installed them in modified Mustang airframes, the results exceeded even optimistic projections. Flight tests conducted in September 1942 showed the new P-51B could climb to 20,000 feet in 5.9 minutes, compared to 9.1 minutes for the Allison-powered version. Maximum speed increased by 26%. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour. The Army Air Force ordered 2,200 Merlin-powered Mustangs before flight testing even concluded. General Henry Arnold reported the order to President Roosevelt with barely contained excitement. By summer 1943, P-51Bs rolled off assembly lines in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas. A Senate War Investigating Committee headed by Harry Truman would later call it the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. But remarkable performance meant nothing if the aircraft never reached the bombers it was designed to protect. Throughout 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign was hemorrhaging. The doctrine was called daylight precision bombing, and it was predicated on a theory that turned out to be murderously wrong. Army Air Force planners believed that B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, could defend themselves through concentrated defensive fire. Flying in tight combat box formations, hundreds of bombers would present overlapping fields of fire that no fighter could penetrate. They would strike German industry with surgical precision, destroying the Nazi war machine piece by piece, and they would do it without fighter escort. The theory survived approximately 90 days of actual combat before reality intervened. German fighters discovered they could make head-on attacks, giving bomber gunners less than 2 seconds to engage before the fighters flashed past at combined closing speeds, exceeding 500 miles per hour. The Germans also learned to hang back beyond effective gun range of the bomber formations, waiting for the moment when American escort fighters, limited by fuel capacity, waggled their wings in farewell and turned for home. That was when the slaughter began. August 17, 1943. 230 B-17 seconds struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, while 146 more bombers hit aircraft plants in Regensburg. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters escorted them as far as the western German border, approximately 200 miles from their English bases. When the P-47 seconds departed, leaving the bombers to continue another 200 miles into Germany's industrial core, the Luftwaffe struck with assembled might. Single-engine German fighters came at the American formations 3 and 4 abreast, firing 20mm cannons at murderously close range. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s stood off and lobbed rockets into the packed bomber formations. By the time the surviving bombers staggered back to England, 60 had been destroyed outright. Another 87 had sustained damage so severe they were scrapped. The United States Army Air Force had effectively lost 147 heavy bombers and 1,500 trained crew members in a single afternoon. The Luftwaffe had lost 31 fighters. The mathematics were unsustainable. At that rate of attrition, the entire 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. October 14th, 1943 brought confirmation of strategic failure. A second raid against Schweinfurt sent 291 bombers into Germany. Again, P-47 escorts could only accompany them for the first 200 miles. Again, the Luftwaffe waited for the escorts to depart before attacking. The bombers flew through a gauntlet of coordinated fighter attacks that lasted for 90 minutes. 60 B-17 seconds failed to return. An additional 17 sustained damage, requiring them to be scrapped upon landing. The 8th Air Force lost 77 heavy bombers in a single mission. Black Thursday, historians would call it. The death knell of unescorted daylight bombing. For the remainder of 1943, 8th Air Force planners restricted missions to targets within range of fighter escort. Coastal France, the Ruhr Valley targets near the German border. Berlin, the heart of Nazi power, lay beyond reach. So did most of Germany's critical war industries. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the effort that was supposed to cripple German production and pave the way for invasion, was failing. Not because American bombers lacked the ability to reach their targets, not because American crews lacked courage, but because fighters could not escort them all the way there and back again. The problem had seemed insoluble. Every fighter aircraft in existence faced the same brutal trade-off: fuel capacity versus performance. To carry enough fuel to match a bomber's range required installing massive fuel tanks, which added weight and drag, destroying the speed and maneuverability that made fighters effective. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter, theoretically had the range for deep escort missions, but P-38 seconds were always in short supply, most of them committed to the Mediterranean theatre. Even when available, the P-38 struggled at high altitude in European winter conditions. Its turbochargers frequently malfunctioned in freezing temperatures. Its cockpit, lacking adequate heating, turned pilots' hands numb during long missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powered by a massive radial engine, was fast and heavily armed. Pilots loved its ruggedness, but even with external drop tanks, P-47 seconds could escort bombers only as far as the German border, before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. The mathematics were immutable. A round trip from England to Berlin covered 1,100 miles. No existing fighter possessed both the fuel capacity and high-altitude performance necessary to make that journey while retaining enough fuel for combat. In November 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England. The 354th Fighter Group received its aircraft and flew its first mission on December 1st, a fighter sweep over France. Initial results were promising but not revolutionary. The P-51B's internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons gave it an escort radius of 320 miles, barely better than a P-47. The aircraft's exceptional aerodynamic efficiency meant it burned fuel more slowly than other fighters, but 320 miles was still 320 miles. Berlin remained out of reach. Then American engineers began experimenting with external fuel tanks, not the small 75-gallon tanks typically used for ferry flights, but massive 108-gallon drop tanks mounted beneath each wing. The Mustang's laminar flow wing produced so little drag that even with two huge tanks hanging beneath it, the aircraft maintained remarkable performance. When threatened, pilots could jettison the external tanks and fight with full maneuverability. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B's escort radius suddenly jumped to 650 miles. Add fuel burned during takeoff and climb, and the aircraft could fly over 1,100 miles, enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, but range alone was insufficient. The P-51B also had to be able to fight at 25,000 feet, where bomber formations cruised. Here, the Merlin engine proved decisive. While German fighters and earlier American designs lost power at high altitude, the Merlin's two-stage supercharger maintained performance. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 410 miles per hour. It could outturn a Messerschmitt 109. It could outclimb a Focke-Wulf 190. And unlike the German fighters, which typically had 90 minutes of fuel for combat, the Mustang could fight for hours before needing to break off for England. The 4th Fighter Group received its P-51Bs on February 28, 1944. The pilots, many of them former Royal Air Force volunteers who had flown Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, had less than a day to familiarize themselves with the new aircraft. Some took off with less than an hour's checkout time in the unfamiliar cockpit. Colonel Donald Blakesley, the group commander, refused to waste time on extensive training. The bombers were dying. His men would learn the P-51 by flying combat missions in it. 4 days later, on March 4th, the 4th Fighter Group escorted B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds to Berlin. It was the first time in history that single-engine fighters had made the 1,100-mile journey. The mission profile was complex, requiring precise timing and coordination. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort the bombers from England to the Dutch-German border. At that point, having reached the limits of their fuel range, the P-47 seconds would waggle their wings and turn for home. The Mustangs, which had taken off later and flown a more direct route, would arrive precisely as the P-47 seconds departed. They would accompany the bombers during the attack on Berlin and shield them on the return leg until another relay of P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds arrived to cover the final stretch back to England. The plan depended on split-second timing. Miss the rendezvous point and the bombers would be defenseless. Burn too much fuel during combat, and the Mustangs would fall from the sky over Germany. Navigate incorrectly, and everyone would be lost over hostile territory. The escort fighters carried no radios capable of communicating with the bombers. They could only follow compass headings and watch for the smoke trails of B-17 seconds against the winter sky. Lieutenant Johnson found the bomber stream over Hanover, exactly where the mission briefing had predicted. 350 B-17 seconds flying in staggered combat boxes, their contrails drawing white lines across the stratosphere. The P-47 seconds were just departing, waggling their wings in their traditional farewell gesture. Johnson and his squadron mates settled into weaving patterns above and beside the bombers, constantly scanning the sky for enemy fighters. Flying escort meant constant vigilance. A Mustang pilot who fixated on the bombers would never see the Messerschmitt dropping from the sun. Below, the frozen landscape of northern Germany unrolled like a map, small towns, farm fields buried in snow, frozen rivers. Occasionally, black puffs of flak appeared as German anti-aircraft batteries fired at the bomber stream, but the flak was sporadic, aimed more at harassment than destruction. The real threat would come from German fighters, and those fighters would be waiting over Berlin. The Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated tactics for destroying American bomber formations. German controllers tracked the incoming raids with radar, then assembled Jagdgeschwader from multiple airfields to concentrate overwhelming force at a single point. A typical interception might involve 50 to 70 German fighters hitting a bomber combat box from multiple angles simultaneously. The fighters made high-speed passes through the formation, firing cannons and rockets before breaking away to regroup for another attack. Defending P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds had disrupted these tactics during missions within their escort range, but the Luftwaffe had learned to simply wait. The American escorts always turned back. They always ran, out of fuel. And when they did, the bombers became targets in a shooting gallery. On March 4, 1944, the Luftwaffe waited again. German radar tracked the bomber stream from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast. Controllers vectored fighter units toward interception points. Experienced German pilots checked their fuel, armed their cannons, and prepared for routine business. The bombers would lumber eastward, unescorted, as they always did on Berlin raids. The Luftwaffe would attack from above and ahead, as it always did. Dozens of four-engine bombers would disintegrate under concentrated fire. It would be bloody, efficient work, but nothing the German fighter pilots had not done many times before. Then something impossible happened. As the bomber stream approached Brandenburg, German fighter pilots spotted escorts, not twin-engine P-38 seconds, which were rare and relatively easy to identify. These were single-engine fighters, sleek silver aircraft with distinctive ventral air intakes. The German pilots initially assumed they were short-range fighters that would soon turn back, but the escorts remained. They stayed with the bombers over Berlin itself. This was supposed to be impossible. The Germans knew precisely how much fuel every Allied fighter could carry. They knew the consumption rates. They had run the calculations dozens of times. No single-engine fighter in existence possessed sufficient range to escort bombers to Berlin from England. It was aerodynamic fact, yet here they were, American fighters weaving above the bomber formations 560 miles from their bases, showing no signs of departing. The German fighter pilots faced a tactical dilemma they had never encountered before. Standing doctrine called for avoiding engagement with escort fighters whenever possible. The mission was to destroy bombers, not fight enemy fighters. Bombers were slow, relatively defenseless targets carrying high explosives over German cities. Fighters were fast, maneuverable, and lethal. Trading experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft for escort fighter kills accomplished nothing if the bombers reached their targets unmolested. But on March 4, 1944, the escorts were not departing. If German fighters ignored them and pressed attacks against the bombers, these unknown American fighters would have free rein to attack from advantageous positions. If the Luftwaffe engaged the escorts, the bombers might slip through to strike Berlin with minimal losses. Either way, the comfortable mathematics of air defense had suddenly become uncertain. Major Heinz Nock, flying a Messerschmitt 109 with Jagdgeschwader 11, watched the American formation approach Berlin from 30,000 feet. He had shot down 29 Allied aircraft since 1940. He had survived combat over Britain, Russia, and France. He understood aerial warfare as thoroughly as any man alive, and he understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. The silver fighters weaving above the bomber stream were not P-47 seconds. They were smaller, faster, more maneuverable, and they showed no indication of turning back. Nock's squadron dove to attack a B-17 combat box. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Before they could complete their firing pass, 4 American fighters dropped on them from above. The engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds. In that brief interval, Nock discovered that the new American fighter could turn inside a Messerschmitt 109 at high altitude. It could dive away from danger faster than German fighters could pursue. And its pilots, contrary to the easy victories Luftwaffe had enjoyed earlier in the war, knew exactly what they were doing. Nock broke off his attack without firing at a single bomber. He had been in aerial combat long enough to recognize when the tactical situation had shifted against him. This was not business as usual. This was something new and extremely dangerous. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, weaving above the bomber formation in his Mustang, spotted the German fighters attacking from the north. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a screaming dive, his wingman tucked in tight beside him. The Merlin engine howled as the airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. Johnson selected the rearmost Messerschmitt in the German formation and lined up his 650 caliber machine guns. The Germans, focused on their attack run against the bombers, never saw him coming. Johnson opened fire at 300 yards. Tracer rounds walked across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Pieces of metal tore away from the fighter's wing root. Smoke streamed from the engine cowling. The German pilot snap-rolled right and dove for the cloud layer below, trailing black smoke. Johnson did not follow. Chasing a single crippled enemy meant abandoning the bombers. The mission was escort, not individual combat. He pulled out of his dive, scanned for threats, and climbed back to the bomber stream. The engagement over Berlin lasted 40 minutes. German fighters made multiple attempts to break through to the bomber formations. Each time, Mustangs intercepted them before they could complete effective firing passes. The American fighters did not simply drive off the German attacks. They actively hunted Luftwaffe fighters, exploiting superior speed and altitude to bounce German formations before they could organize coordinated strikes against the bombers. When German pilots tried to disengage and return to their bases to refuel, the Mustangs pursued them, shooting down aircraft attempting to land and strafing parked fighters on the ground. 69 American bombers failed to return from the March 4th raid. Most fell to flak, the devastating ground-based anti-aircraft artillery that no fighter escort could prevent. But bomber crews who survived the mission reported something unprecedented. For the first time over Berlin, they had seen their escorts throughout the entire mission. The little friends had been there during the bomb run, when aircraft typically are most vulnerable. They had been there during the rally after bombs away, when damaged stragglers fell behind the protection of the main formation. And they had been there during the long journey back across Germany, when exhausted crews counted minutes until they reached the Channel. The Germans lost 17 fighters over Berlin on March 4th. The number itself was not catastrophic. The Luftwaffe could sustain fighter losses in that range, at least in the short term. But the strategic implications were devastating. If American fighters could escort bombers to Berlin, they could escort them anywhere in Germany. There was no safe distance anymore. No line beyond which German industry could operate free from American bombs and American fighters. Every aircraft factory, every synthetic fuel plant, every ball-bearing works, every railroad marshalling yard was now vulnerable to daylight precision attack. The entire German air defense strategy, carefully constructed around the mathematical impossibility of long-range fighter escort, had become obsolete in a single morning. The following day, March 5th, P-51 Mustangs escorted B-24 Liberators almost to the Spanish border. On March 6, they were over Berlin again. This time, Mustang pilots claimed 17 German fighters destroyed for the loss of 3 P-51 seconds. The 4th Fighter Group flew 4 Berlin escort missions in the first week of March. They had transitioned to the P-51B on February 28. Within 7 days, they were ranging freely over Germany, destroying enemy aircraft in their own airspace, demonstrating to both German pilots and German civilians that the Luftwaffe could no longer defend the Reich. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, had made extravagant promises to the German people. In 1940, he famously declared that if Allied bombers ever reached Berlin, Germans could call him Meyer. Bombs had fallen on Berlin before March 1944, but always at night when RAF Lancasters could hide in darkness. Daylight raids had been impossible because bombers required fighter protection and fighters lacked the range. Now, in broad daylight, American bombers were bombing Berlin while American fighters shot down German aircraft over the capital itself. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated Göring, General Karl Spaatz asked him directly, "When did you know the Luftwaffe was losing control of the air?" Göring's answer was precise. When the American long-range fighters were able to escort bombers as far as Hanover, he said, it was not long before they reached Berlin. When he saw them over his capital, he knew the war was lost. Göring elaborated further. The reason for the failure of the Luftwaffe against the Allied air forces, he stated, was the success of the American air forces in producing a long-range escort fighter airplane, which enabled bombers to penetrate deep into Reich territory while maintaining constant fighter cover. Without that escort, the air offensive would never have succeeded. The strategic implications rippled outward with remarkable speed. By mid-March 1944, additional P-51 units had converted from P-47 seconds. The 8th Air Force began systematically swapping P-47 groups to the 9th Air Force in exchange for P-51 units. The goal was to equip as many bomber escort squadrons as possible with the long-range Mustang. In January 1944, Major General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, who had led the famous April 1942 raid on Tokyo, brought with him a fundamental change in fighter employment doctrine. Under previous doctrine, escort fighters stayed close to the bomber formations, flying defensive patterns designed to intercept German fighters before they could attack the bombers. The problem with purely defensive escort was that it gave the initiative to German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots could choose when and where to engage. They could assemble overwhelming force at a single point, knowing the escorts were spread thin, protecting multiple bomber groups. Defensive escort reduced bomber losses but did not destroy the German fighter force. Doolittle changed the mission. Effective February 1944, fighter escorts were authorized to break away from bomber formations to pursue and destroy German fighters. The goal was not merely to defend bombers during individual missions. The goal was to achieve air superiority by destroying the Luftwaffe fighter force itself. Mustang groups began flying fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations, hunting German fighters before they could assemble for coordinated attacks. Returning from escort missions, P-51 pilots were encouraged to strafe German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and forcing the Luftwaffe to divert resources to airfield defense. The change in doctrine coincided perfectly with the arrival of the long-range Mustang. For the first time, American fighters could both escort bombers throughout their missions and actively seek out German fighters for destruction. The combination proved devastating. In February 1944, during the week-long series of raids known as Big Week, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. These were not novice pilots fresh from training. These were men with hundreds of hours of combat experience, men who had survived the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean theatre. They were irreplaceable, and they were dying at a rate the Luftwaffe could not sustain. German aircraft production actually increased throughout 1944 despite sustained Allied bombing. By dispersing manufacturing to smaller facilities and prioritizing fighter production over other aircraft types, German industry produced thousands of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. The factories could build fighters faster than Allied bombs destroyed them. But factories could not build experienced pilots. Training time for Luftwaffe pilots had been slashed from over 200 hours in 1942 to less than 100 hours by late 1944. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received minimal flight instruction. Many German pilots reached frontline fighter units with less than 20 hours of actual flight time. They arrived at their squadrons, were shown which aircraft to fly, and were killed on their first or second combat mission. American and British pilot training, by contrast, produced 29,000 pilots in 1944 alone. American pilots received more than 3 times the flight training hours of their German counterparts. They practiced aerial combat using link trainers, mechanical simulators that allowed students to rehearse instrument flying and combat tactics without risking aircraft or lives. American pilots arrived at combat units with hundreds of hours of flight experience. They knew their aircraft intimately. They had practiced air-to-air gunnery until deflection shooting became instinctive. When they engaged German fighters, experience and training typically decided the outcome. The introduction of the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight in late 1944 further increased American effectiveness. Earlier gun sights required pilots to manually calculate lead angles when firing at maneuvering targets. The K-14 automatically computed deflection based on target range and angular velocity. A pilot needed only to frame the target in the sight's reticle, and the gun sight calculated proper lead. Combined with superior training and better aircraft, the K-14 turned Mustang pilots into remarkably efficient fighter killers. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies of Western Europe. German fighters still existed. German factories continued producing aircraft, but the Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied air superiority in any meaningful sense. On D-Day itself, over 11,000 Allied aircraft operated over the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 100 sorties. German forces invading France in 1940 had enjoyed complete air superiority. German forces defending France in 1944 operated under skies dominated by Allied aircraft. The transformation had required less than 4 months. The cost in human lives was staggering on both sides. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 26,000 men killed during the strategic bombing campaign. Many died aboard bombers shot down, despite fighter escort. Flak remained lethal throughout the war. A direct hit from an 88mm shell would tear a bomber apart regardless of how many friendly fighters circled overhead. But the losses would have been exponentially worse without long-range fighter escort. During Black Week in October 1943, before the Mustang arrived in numbers, bomber loss rates approached 20%. By summer 1944, with Mustang escorts ranging freely over Germany, bomber loss rates had dropped below 2%. The difference represented thousands of lives saved, thousands of men who returned to England instead of dying over German soil. German casualties were equally severe. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 25,000 fighter pilots killed during the war. Many died fighting Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, but the Western air campaign extracted a terrible toll. Kurt Bühligen, a German fighter ace who survived the war, later recalled that pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to defend Germany against American daylight raids rarely survived. These men, experienced in combat against Soviet aircraft, simply had no comprehension of what they faced in the West. American fighters appeared in overwhelming numbers, flown by well-trained pilots in aircraft equal or superior to German fighters. Combined with American numerical superiority and German fuel shortages, the attrition was unsustainable. The P-51 Mustang itself underwent continuous refinement throughout the war. The P-51D model, introduced in summer 1944, featured a bubble canopy that provided all-around visibility. Earlier models had a razorback design that created blind spots behind the pilot. The bubble canopy eliminated those blind spots, allowing pilots to see threats approaching from any angle. The P-51D also increased armament from 4 to 6 50 caliber machine guns and simplified the ammunition feed system, reducing gun jams that had plagued earlier models. Nearly 8,000 P-51Ds were built, making it the most numerous Mustang variant. The final evolution was the P-51H, designed specifically for operations against Japan. The P-51H incorporated weight reduction measures that decreased empty weight by more than 500 pounds compared to the P-51D. It featured a more powerful engine with water injection for emergency power. Maximum speed reached 487 miles per hour, making the P-51H one of the fastest piston engine fighters to enter production during World War II. The P-51H arrived too late to see combat against Japan, but it demonstrated the extent to which the basic Mustang design could be refined and improved. In the Pacific theater, P-51 seconds flying from Iwo Jima escorted B-29 Superfortress bombers on raids against Japan. The distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo was approximately 675 miles, well within the Mustang's range. Pacific theater Mustangs typically carried two 110-gallon drop tanks plus full internal fuel, giving them endurance for escort missions lasting over 7 hours. The presence of fighter escorts over Japan represented the same strategic shift that had occurred over Germany. Japanese air defenses, designed around the assumption that American bombers would arrive unescorted, suddenly faced fighters that could fly the entire mission profile. By the war's end, P-51 Mustangs had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. The aircraft served not only as bomber escort but also as fighter bomber, ground attack aircraft, and reconnaissance platform. Its versatility and performance made it the gold standard for piston engine fighters, but its most important contribution was strategic rather than tactical. The P-51 broke the fundamental constraint that had limited strategic bombing since the beginning of aerial warfare. It proved that fighters could escort bombers anywhere, transforming strategic bombing from a theory that worked better on paper than in practice to a devastating reality that German industry could not survive. The human cost of the strategic bombing campaign remains controversial. German cities were reduced to rubble. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died in bombing raids. Whether the destruction of German industry and morale justified the human suffering is a question historians continue to debate. But within the narrower question of military strategy, the impact is undeniable. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe from 1939 through 1942, was broken as an effective fighting force by mid-1944. The breaking required not just bombs and bombers, but also the ability to project fighter power deep into enemy territory. Without that capability, strategic bombing would have failed. With it, Allied air forces achieved complete air superiority. The story of the P-51 Mustang is ultimately a story about the unpredictability of technological development. The aircraft began as an emergency British order to a company that it had never built fighters. It was powered by an engine originally designed for an entirely different aircraft. Its transformation from low-altitude reconnaissance plane to high-altitude fighter happened through a chance suggestion by a test pilot. The external fuel tanks that gave it sufficient range to reach Berlin were developed as an afterthought. None of it was planned, much of it was accidental. Yet the end result changed the course of World War II. On the morning of March 4, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Johnson had no sense that he was making history. He was simply flying another combat mission, this one to Berlin instead of to targets closer to England. He could not know that Goering would later identify that exact mission as the moment he knew Germany would lose the war. Johnson could not know that the silver fighter he flew would become iconic, that decades later it would be remembered as perhaps the finest piston engine fighter ever built. He knew only that he had enough fuel to reach Berlin and return, that his aircraft was fast and maneuverable, and that his job was to protect the bombers from enemy fighters. The simplicity of that mission profile concealed its strategic importance. For years, the Allies had struggled with the problem of projecting power deep into German territory. Bombers could reach distant targets but suffered catastrophic losses without fighter protection. Fighters could defeat German interceptors but lacked the range to escort bombers throughout their missions. The stalemate had cost thousands of lives and threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. The P-51 Mustang, through a combination of aerodynamic efficiency and powerful engineering, solved that problem. It gave Allied commanders the tool they needed to achieve air superiority, and air superiority, once achieved, proved decisive. German engineers recognized the threat immediately. Captured P-51 seconds were extensively tested at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main testing facility. German test pilots confirmed what combat pilots had reported. The Mustang was faster, more maneuverable at high altitude, and had far greater range than any fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory. The Germans attempted to develop comparable long-range fighters, but by 1944, German industry was struggling simply to maintain production of existing designs. Resources that might have gone to new fighter development instead went to building more Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, aircraft that were fundamentally outclassed by the P-51. The Germans also invested heavily in jet fighters, hoping that superior speed would compensate for inferior numbers. The Messerschmitt 262 jet was indeed faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. The veterans who flew P-51 seconds over Germany carried their memories for the rest of their lives. They remembered the cold at 30,000 feet, where temperatures dropped below negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They remembered the loneliness of scanning an empty sky, while knowing that somewhere in that emptiness, enemy fighters were hunting them. They remembered the controlled terror of aerial combat, where death came at 500 miles per hour and survival depended on seeing the threat first. And they remembered the pride of bringing their bombers home, of watching the big ships land safely because fighter escorts had kept the German fighters away. Bomber crews developed deep affection for their little friends. The nickname was used universally throughout the 8th Air Force. B-17 gunners would watch for the distinctive silhouettes of P-51 seconds weaving above their formations and feel measurably safer. When fuel ran low and escorts waggled their wings before departing for home, bomber crews felt naked and vulnerable. But increasingly, as more Mustang groups became operational, the escorts didn't depart. They remained throughout the mission, invisible guardians circling at higher altitude, ready to dive on any German fighter that threatened the bombers. The presence of escorts, more than any other single factor, allowed bomber crews to believe they might survive their required number of missions and return home. The transformation happened with remarkable speed. In October 1943, unescorted bombers were being slaughtered over Germany. By March 1944, fighters were escorting bombers to Berlin. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been driven from Western European skies. The entire revolution required less than 8 months from the first operational P-51 units until complete air superiority. Military historians studying the campaign have struggled to identify any comparable example of such rapid strategic reversal achieved through a single weapons system. The tank revolutionized ground warfare but required years to reach its full potential. The aircraft carrier transformed naval warfare but did so over the course of decades. The P-51 Mustang changed aerial warfare in months. The German expectation that fighters could never escort bombers to Berlin was not foolish. It was based on sound engineering analysis and combat experience. Every calculation suggested that such a mission profile was impossible. The fuel required to fly 1,100 miles, plus reserves for combat and emergency diversion, exceeded what any practical fighter could carry. Adding sufficient fuel capacity meant adding weight and drag that would destroy performance. The mathematics appeared ironclad. The Germans were not wrong to base their strategy on those calculations. They were merely unlucky that American engineers had designed an aircraft whose exceptional efficiency broke the normal rules. The laminar flow wing, developed through years of wind tunnel testing at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, produced drag coefficients that seemed almost fraudulent compared to conventional wing designs. The Packard Merlin engine, developed by Rolls-Royce for an entirely different purpose and built in America under license, provided power and efficiency at high altitude that no other engine could match. The combination of low-drag airframe and high-performance engine created an aircraft whose range-to-performance ratio exceeded anything previously built. Add external drop tanks, which could be jettisoned when empty to restore full performance, and the result was a fighter that could go anywhere and fight anything. The story ends, inevitably, with numbers. By war's end, approximately 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been built. They equipped 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force by late 1944. They destroyed 4,900 enemy aircraft in the European theatre alone. They escorted bombers on 39,000 combat missions. They achieved air superiority over Germany, enabling the D-Day invasion and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The human cost was severe. 550 American pilots died flying Mustangs in combat, but those deaths purchased strategic advantage that no other weapon system could have delivered. The long-range Escort fighter, dismissed as impossible by both sides in 1942, became the decisive weapon of the European air war by 1944. On March 4, 1944, when Lieutenant Johnson crossed the Dutch coast heading east toward Berlin, neither he nor anyone else fully understood the strategic implications of that mission. They understood only that they were attempting something that had never been done before. They would soon discover that they had accomplished something the Germans believed could never be done at all. Fighter escorts had reached Berlin. The mathematics that had seemed immutable were wrong, and in the months that followed, the Luftwaffe would pay the price for that miscalculation with its pilots' lives and its nation's defeat. The Silver fighters, with ventral air intakes and laminar flow wings, continued to range over Germany until victory in Europe was secured. They became symbols of American technological achievement and industrial might, but they were more than symbols. They were the tools that broke German air defenses, that shattered the Luftwaffe fighter force, that made strategic bombing effective instead of suicidal. When Hermann Göring saw them over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. When German fighter pilots engaged them in combat, they discovered that experience and courage could not overcome numerical superiority and superior equipment. And when the war finally ended, the P-51 Mustang stood as proof that strategic assumptions, no matter how thoroughly calculated, could be overturned by engineering excellence and industrial determination. The Germans never expected fighters to escort bombers to Berlin. The mathematics said it was impossible. The Mustang proved the mathematics wrong. And in that miscalculation lies one of the most decisive turning points of World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.